In January of 1946, Kyiv became the stage for a trial against a group of Nazis, an event charged with propaganda and vengeance. 15 Germans, responsible for the massacre at Babyn Yar and other war crimes, were brought before a Soviet court. In those days, tens of thousands of Jews were killed in an act that embodied barbarity in all its horror. This trial not only sought to punish the guilty, it was also an act of collective memory against the invasion that the Soviet Union had endured. But this story begins with the annexation of Ukraine by the Third Reich. On June 22, 1941, the sky over Ukraine filled with the roar of German war machinery. Operation Barbarossa had begun. German tanks moved like metallic beasts over Ukrainian soil, while planes flew overhead, announcing drastic changes. The Soviets, taken by surprise, barely managed to resist in the face of the overwhelming attack. In just one day, Western Ukraine began to yield to the unstoppable advance of German forces. In this tide of death and destruction, Lviv began to be taken in July. August witnessed the brutality of the German advance when, after encircling Soviet troops at the Battle of Uman, German soldiers cut their way toward the heart of Ukraine. September brought the end of resistance in Kyiv. On the 19th of that month, the city fell into German hands, marking one of the most pivotal moments for Ukraine. The Nazis wasted no time establishing their dominion. By October, the Nazi flag was flying over much of Ukraine. Dnipro, Kharkiv, and other strategic cities were quickly taken. The Germans implemented their regime, imposing a policy of terror that included mass executions, deportations, and systematic repression. Stories of entire families disappearing, improvised concentration camps, and soldiers who knew no remorse began to circulate in whispers among the survivors. But the winter of 1942 turned the tide of the war. The German supply lines began to fracture under the growing resistance, not only from the Red Army but also from Ukrainian partisans who, hidden in the forests, launched guerrilla attacks on the invaders. The cold, always an ally of the Russian and Ukrainian soil, worked to erode the morale and strength of the Germans. The summer of that year saw a renewed German effort with Operation Blue, which aimed to control the oil fields of the Caucasus. But despite their initial advances, resistance in Ukraine became fiercer. The battles grew longer and bloodier. The German forces, already worn down by winter and tenacious Soviet resistance, became bogged down. And in the winter of 1943, the Red Army launched its definitive offensive. The Battle of Stalingrad was a mortal blow for the Germans, but Ukraine would not be free until the following year. In January of 1944, Soviet forces began the arduous task of liberating Ukrainian territory, city by city, village by village. Every liberated corner was soaked in blood, but the end of the German occupation was irreversible. By March, Soviet troops were advancing with strength, recapturing cities that had been subjected to Nazi domination. Total liberation would come at the end of 1944, although small German forces would continue fighting in their last gasps until May of 1945. By January of 1946, the cold embraced the city of Kyiv, but it could not cool the spirits stirring in the Soviet courts. There, in that somber, tension-filled space, a spectacle unfolded that some would compare, not without a hint of irony, to the Nuremberg trials. Although, of course, in the Soviet style, everything seemed more brutal, more rigid. Justice, in this case, had a strong taste of vengeance, and no one hid that fact. The accused, men with hardened faces and lost gazes, waited in silence. They were mostly Germans, but there were also some Ukrainian collaborators, traitors who had helped the invading Third Reich massacre their own countrymen. The Soviets, always efficient in their way of presenting Nazi atrocities, spared no macabre details. The evidence was overwhelming, as was the blood that the accused tried to ignore. Records of the murders, photographs of mass graves, and heartbreaking testimonies from those who had survived the impossible. The victims, now witnesses, took the stand with the weight of history on their shoulders, recounting again and again how the Nazis, with the help of their local accomplices, had taken children, the elderly, mothers and fathers, and shot them down as if they were little more than cattle. As expected, the Soviets, proud of their justice system and their ideals of socialist equality, were not going to let these crimes go unpunished. The importance of these trials, however, did not reside solely in immediate justice. The Soviets sought something more, a narrative that would consolidate their role as the true victims of National Socialism and as the victors of the war. While in Nuremberg, abstract concepts like crimes against humanity were discussed, in Kyiv they spoke of the blood spilled on their own soil. The crimes against Ukrainians were not something discussed in terms of international law. They were crimes against the Soviet homeland, and that required a different kind of justice, one that was written on the face of each of those executed. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, here there was no room for doubt or diplomacy between powers. No, in Kyiv, the sentence would be swift and public. After all, for the Soviet regime, these men deserved nothing more than a humiliating and exemplary end. And so it was. The final fate of those henchmen was public execution. The Soviet regime, always so efficient in its handling of propaganda, ensured that these trials would be remembered as a key moment in post-war history. But beyond the war and the occupation of Ukraine by the Third Reich, what were those unforgivable crimes of the Nazis on Ukrainian soil? They were many, far from insignificant. The Germans not only carried out one of the most notorious genocides of the Holocaust, but also imposed terror as a way of life on those Slavic lands. Death Ravine, the silenced tragedy of Babyn Yar. To begin with the events that justified the trials of '46, the massacre of Babyn Yar was an event that left an indelible mark on the history of Ukraine and the Holocaust. It occurred over 2 days, from September 29th to 30th, 1941, in a ravine near Kyiv. This episode has become one of the most notorious and cited examples of the mass murders carried out by Nazi Germany. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, a systematic campaign was implemented to exterminate the Jewish population in the occupied territories. In Kyiv, before the massacre, approximately 224,000 Jews lived in the city. However, many had already fled or been evacuated in the face of the advancing German forces. By the end of September 1941, only about 33,771 Jews remained in the city when the Nazi regime issued orders for them to gather at Babyn Yar, ostensibly for relocation or forced labor. The immediate trigger for the massacre was a series of explosions on September 24th that damaged the German military headquarters in Kyiv. The Nazis, almost immediately, blamed the Jewish population of the city for these attacks. In retaliation, they decided to carry out mass executions as a form of collective punishment and vengeance against the Jews. On the morning of September 26th, notices were posted throughout Kyiv ordering Jews to gather at Babyn Yar with their belongings under threat of death. Many of them, deceived by the promise of a safe evacuation, obeyed the orders without imagining the fate that awaited them. On September 29th, a cold dawn marked the beginning of one of the darkest days in history. Throughout the morning, groups of Jews were forcibly led toward that ravine near the city. Once there, they were forced to undress, humiliated in their final hour. The memories of those who survived the slaughter are chilling. Men, women, and children were lined up at the edge of the ravine, facing their imminent execution. The members of the Einsatzgruppen, along with local auxiliary police, fired mercilessly. The bullets whistled and echoed, turning the place into a scene of despair and horror. For approximately 36 hours, the victims were executed en masse, their bodies falling in layers into the shallow graves that would be their final resting place. The brutality of the execution methods was staggering. The victims were riddled with machine gun fire at close range, while their bodies piled up at the bottom of the ravine. In those 2 days, approximately 33,771 people fell, about 13 per minute. But it is estimated that between 100,000 and 150,000 people were murdered at Babyn Yar over time, including not only Jews, but also Soviet prisoners of war and Roma. One of the most heartbreaking scenes described from those terrible moments is that of families being separated, the cries of children resonating in the air as their parents were led to a fate from which they would never return. Days went by, and as the murders intensified, the massacre at Babyn Yar became not only a place of death, but also an extermination field. After the first 2 days of executions, the Nazis continued their extermination work at the site, using the ravine as a human dumping ground where they disposed of thousands of bodies. As Soviet forces advanced toward Kyiv, The Nazi authorities felt pressured to hide the evidence of their atrocious crimes. But the horror didn't stop there. Babyn Yar remained a site of additional executions until the Soviets recaptured Kyiv in November of 1943. Over the years, memorials have been established at the site to honor those who lost their lives there, although it took a long time before the specific identity of the Jewish victims was officially acknowledged. Initially, the Soviet regime avoided recognizing the Jewish population as the primary victims at Babyn Yar, preferring to present the victims as Soviet citizens in general. And of course, it was a fundamental event for the condemnation of the Germans in the Kyiv trials of '46. Nazi occupation in Ukraine frustrated hope and covered up crimes. However, the Babyn Yar massacre was not the only grievance against the German presence in Ukraine during World War II. Ukrainians lived a complex and brutal reality under German occupation during World War II, which lasted from 1941 to 1944. This period was marked by severe repression, exploitation, and mass violence, although there were also groups that temporarily benefited from the occupation. It should be noted that, at the beginning of the occupation, some Ukrainians welcomed the Germans as liberators from Soviet oppression. This was especially notable in the western regions, such as Galicia, where there was a strong belief that Germany might support Ukrainian independence. However, this perception quickly changed. Soon the Nazis imposed harsh policies and administrative structures that undermined any hope for autonomy. The territory was divided into the Reichskommissariat Ukraine and the District of Galicia, and local government was largely controlled by German authorities. The racial repression of the Nazi regime was brutal and primarily targeted Jews and other minorities. Approximately 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews were killed during the Holocaust, with mass executions carried out in places like Babyn Yar. Additionally, around 2,200,000 Ukrainians were forced to work in Germany as slave labor, known as Ostarbeiter, subjected to extreme working conditions while their communities suffered food shortages and economic degradation. Cultural repression was rampant. Education was limited to elementary levels and political activities were severely restricted. Only the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was allowed to function, though under strict control. The Nazi administration focused on extracting resources for its colossal war effort, leading to widespread poverty and suffering among the local population. While many Ukrainians suffered under the occupation, some groups attempted to collaborate with the Nazis in the hope of achieving their national goals. Organizations like the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists initially cooperated with German forces, but they faced severe reprisals once their political ambitions became apparent. Factions within that organization, such as the OUNM and OUNB, had different approaches regarding collaboration and resistance. Some Ukrainians participated in auxiliary police forces or military units aligned with the Nazis, committing acts of violence against Jews and Poles as part of broader ethnic conflicts fueled by nationalist sentiments. This collaboration often involved committing war crimes, including participation in massacres during the Holocaust. However, it should also be highlighted that the occupation brought with it groups that benefited, at least temporarily. Those aligned with Nazi interests found comparative advantages, such as positions in local administration or in the police forces. Some members of nationalist groups believed that collaboration could lead to greater autonomy or independence for Ukraine. However, most of the population faced terrible disadvantages. The Jewish community found itself in a situation of extermination, while others suffered due to forced labor, food shortages, cultural repression, and a significantly deteriorated economy due to resource extraction for the German war effort. The nationalist leaders who initially sought cooperation were arrested or executed when they posed a threat to Nazi control. As the war progressed, the situation became increasingly desperate. The brutality of the German occupation forces became ever more evident, and the idea that the Germans were liberators faded amidst oppression and terror. During the German occupation, the Nazis employed various strategies to cover up their crimes against humanity, particularly the Holocaust and the massacres of Jews and other groups. Their efforts were driven by the desire to maintain control and suppress dissent, as well as to avoid international attention. One of the most effective tactics was the use of local collaborators. which has already been described, who helped facilitate the capture and execution of Jews and other perceived enemies. In this way, the Nazis could distance themselves from direct involvement in these atrocities. This collaboration was crucial in creating a facade of local support for Nazi policies, which they could present as aligned with local interests. In turn, the Nazi regime spread propaganda portraying their actions as necessary to maintain order and combat Bolshevism. By framing their occupation as a liberation from Soviet oppression, the Nazis attempted to cultivate a narrative that justified their brutal policies. This included the creation of Ukrainian committees that acted as intermediaries between German authorities and local populations, promoting the idea that the Germans were allies in the fight against communism. The Nazis also engaged in the physical elimination of evidence related to their crimes. Mass graves were sometimes hidden or destroyed after executions, especially in areas where large-scale murders had taken place. As the war progressed, the Einsatzgruppen attempted to cover up mass graves or, at the very least, move bodies to obscure the extent of their actions. Censorship and information control were other tools in their arsenal. The occupation authorities imposed strict censorship on local media and communications. Any dissent or reports about the atrocities committed by German forces were severely punished. This suppression of information aimed to prevent public awareness of the extent of Nazi crimes, both locally and internationally. The occupation became more oppressive as military campaigns progressed, and the Nazis' cover-up strategies revealed a deep concern over possible resistance from both the local population and partisans. They feared that knowledge of their atrocities could spark uprisings or organized resistance movements. For this reason, they took extreme measures to suppress any signs of dissent, including executing those suspected of being partisans and collaborators who opposed their regime. The fear of international backlash also weighed heavily on Nazi decisions. They knew that if the details of their genocidal policies became widely known, there could be a reaction greater than the war itself, threatening their war efforts. Thus, by covering up their crimes, they sought to avoid condemnation that could undermine their authority. It should also be noted that they were not always successful in these cover-up efforts. Obedience and death, the echoes of Babyn Yar in the Kyiv court. Returning to the main topic, the trial known as the Nuremberg of Kyiv unearthed from the depths of the human soul old arguments that, though worn by history, had not lost their ability to reverberate within the cold walls of justice. The accused, men whose faces, hardened by war, showed not the slightest trace of humanity, clung to a defense as ancient as it was absurd. "We were only following orders," a phrase that in some way sought to shield them under the dark shadow of blind obedience, as if they were merely the cogs in a machine where other parts did the thinking and organizing of crimes. Whenever this argument is used, it always ends the same. They claimed to have acted under unbearable pressure, that threats from their superiors left them at a crossroads between obedience and death. They said it with great cynicism. It was as if somehow they expected sympathy, a pardon based on fear. But Soviet thought was clear. How could fear justify the cruel and inhuman? And above all, how could they be forgiven for taking part of their territory by force? Throughout the trial, the accused attempted to justify the unjustifiable. There was no emotion or confidence in their voices, only the methodical tone of someone who repeats something so many times it begins to sound believable. They claimed that the orders they received were legal, using Russian and German law as a shield. Some of the accused, with unsettling calm, insisted that there had been no intent to commit crimes. Their excuse, if it could be called that, was that the atrocities, the destruction and the deaths were mere collateral consequences of larger military objectives. To them, it seemed, civilian life, the lives of children and the elderly, could be easily dragged into the fray of military sacrifice, as if no military action had been calculated or planned, but instead was merely the result of the inherent chaos of war, that voracious monster they themselves had fueled and carried out. The cynicism was such that some attempted to question the very jurisdiction of the court, arguing that international laws should not apply to a nation as unique as Russia. That argument wasn't new, but in this context, it sounded as misaligned as it was ridiculous. It was as if they were trying to cover the traces of their crimes under a layer of legalistic bureaucracy. a sort of ruse where the cold letter of the law was meant to serve as their refuge, forgetting that the weight of the trial ultimately rested on concrete actions that were documented. The rawest moments of the trial arose when some of the accused, with the indifference of someone who had witnessed too much death, shrugged at the accusations. There was neither denial nor acceptance, just a cold apathy that was as unsettling as the most aggressive words. It wasn't that they believed themselves innocent, it was simply that they didn't care. It seemed the enormity of their acts had robbed them of something fundamental, a sense of guilt. There were also those who decided to show a hint of remorse, but even that apparent contrition was tinged with justifications. Yes, perhaps they had committed crimes, but they did so under the weight of military responsibility and a strong patriotism that left them no choice. Remorse in that room didn't carry the profound echo it should have. It felt like just another act in the tragedy of war. History, with its cruel persistence, seemed to repeat the same pattern: war crimes, mechanical defenses, and a justice that, though delayed, was still necessary. On the other hand, the testimonies of the victims, both inside and outside the trial, were revealing. Wasily Mikhailovsky was barely a child when his nanny received the order to take him to Babyn Yar. At first, his young mind didn't understand the meaning of those words delivered with coldness. "Take the Jewish brat to Babyn Yar." That's what he heard in a disdainful tone. His nanny had no idea of the danger lurking either. Only when they passed the first line of guards and gunfire thundered through the air did the truth hit her like a bucket of cold water. She knew they were being taken to their deaths. Wasily cried and pleaded, but the tears of a child in wartime rarely find a satisfying answer. In the line of the condemned, people whispered in the endless wait. Fortunately for them, the line of those condemned to death moved along, and they stayed there until night fell. Then they slipped away, saving themselves in this way. Dina Pronicheva, another survivor, was saved almost by chance. They managed to shoot her and she fell into the ravine, but later she was able to crawl out and evade the Nazi soldiers who stood guard outside, shooting at any survivor who tried to escape. In her own words, "Each time I saw a new group of men and women, the elderly and children, forced to take off their clothes. They were all led to an open pit where they were shot. Then they would bring another group. With my own eyes, I saw that horror. Even though I wasn't close to the pit, I could hear the terrifying screams of panic and the soft voices of children crying out, 'Mama, Mama!' No one escaped that fate. Death, which in normal times comes quietly, there arrived with screams, with bursts of bullets devouring bodies without a hint of humanity. Elena Borodiansky-Knish was among those who fell into the pit, but she and her daughter, by what seemed like a true miracle, were not struck by the bullets. They threw themselves among the corpses, those lifeless bodies that had walked beside them just minutes before. They remained motionless, surrounded by the stench of death, waiting for the noise to stop and for the Nazis to leave. As the daylight began to fade, Elena understood that the line between life and death could be as thin as the silence of a bullet that did not reach her. In Babyn Yar, people were stripped not only of life but also of their last possessions. As if that weren't enough, Babyn Yar had become a theatre, where the main actors dressed themselves in the clothes of the dead, taking advantage of their misfortune. Anatoly Kuznetsov, with a bitterness in his voice that seemed to pierce the silence, recounted how even the sick, the children, and pregnant women were snatched from their beds, pushed toward the fate awaiting them in that ravine. There were no exceptions. Fragile bodies, those closest to life or death, were treated with the same cruelty as the rest. Every human being who walked towards Babyn Yar was already condemned, their lives measured in minutes, their names forgotten by those who decided who lived and who died. Years later, the writer Yevgeny Yevtushenko described that horror with heartbreaking words. He said, "I myself, like a long silent scream above the thousands and thousands buried, I'm every elderly person executed here, I'm every child killed here." The testimonies in the trial were, in their own way, living scars. An anonymous witness recalled the hell that was Babyn Yar. Bodies everywhere, the landscape of an apocalypse come true. He described how soldiers shot the victims in groups, making them stand at the edge of the pit before pulling the trigger. He remembered the faces of his neighbors, of his friends, all lined up, knowing this was the end, that there would be no return. The screams, the sobs, the whispers of despair, all of it continued to haunt his memory. Every night in his dreams, he relived the scene over and over as a nightmare, as if he could never escape the echoes of that day. General Roman Rudenko, the prosecutor of the trial, with his firm voice, demanded the harshest possible sentence for those who had committed such atrocities. The day had come, he said, when humanity demanded just retribution. Execution in the square, the sentencing of the guilty at the Kyiv Nuremberg. Thus, the Extraordinary State Commission, formed by Soviet authorities after liberating the city in 1943, had gathered enough evidence to bring to trial those who had participated in these crimes. Among the accused were names that would echo with infamy, men whose lives had been intertwined with the death of thousands in those lands. The trial focused on 15 former members of the German police who sat in the defendant's dock, surrounded by the inquisitive gaze of a public longing for justice. The process was notable for its focus on the individualization of the guilty. Each defendant was presented with his name and rank, ending their anonymity and exposing them to society and the world for their crimes. Fritz Beckenhoff, one of the main defendants, had been present at the executions, his name whispered among the attendees like a spell that conjured images of terror. Karl Burkhardt, another man on the stand, was equally guilty, actively participating in the execution of Jews and other civilians in Ukraine. Georg Heinisch, also present in that court, was a name survivors recognized with horror. His crime was simple. He had been complicit in genocide. Beside him, Wilhelm Hellerforth, a man who had committed various atrocities, seemed like a shadow fallen into darkness, his life dedicated to repression and death bearing the worst fruits. On the other hand, Hans Eisenmann, who had been a direct executioner, seemed to absorb the weight of his actions as the prosecutor read the evidence against him and listened to the testimonies. Emil Jogschat, an orchestrator of death, and Emil Knoll, who had participated in the brutality that characterized the Nazi occupation, also occupied their places in the trial. Willy Meyer and Paul von Scheer shared the same fate, their complicity in genocide crying out for vengeance. The trial became an event, a public manifestation of the contained anger of a territory that had seen its sovereignty violated and its population enslaved. The execution of 12 of the accused was scheduled for January 29, 1946. The executions were planned to be carried out in Kiev's central square, a place that had already witnessed mass suffering. When the fateful day arrived, the square was full. People from all over gathered to witness what had been presented as a moment of justice and Soviet propaganda. The ropes, in a macabre symbolism, represented the final judgment, the culmination of a series of crimes that had left an indelible mark on history. The men were led to the gallows, their faces reflecting despair and resignation. The testimonies of their crimes lingered in the air. They were still very recent, and mourners were present. Indeed, there were those gathered there who celebrated this act of justice. There was also a palpable sense of emptiness. But a reflection also emerged. Could the hanging of these men truly fill the void left by the loss of so many lives? The answer to this question was that the emotions of those present were complex. Some felt that nothing could repair the damage, while others sought closure that had long eluded them. As the ropes tightened, the square filled with a tense silence, a silence that spoke more than 1,000 words. History, in its cruel irony, showed that justice didn't always operate with simplicity, and that sometimes what was presented as an act of reparation was only a reminder of the depth of the wound. Eckhard Hans von Chammer and Osten, Georg Truckenbrod and Oskar Walliser, each of them also faced their fate on this day. They were all men of action, responsible for the death of innocents, for decisions made in the heat of war's excesses. As the rope tightened, many thought of how the horror of what they had done had affected not only their victims, but also their own souls. As the sun set, Kyiv's square slowly emptied, leaving behind a heavy silence. The ropes that once tied these men to their crimes now hung limp, a symbol of a justice that, though it had manifested, left a void for many family members and friends. The execution of those 12 men did not erase the pain or undo the past. It simply added another layer to the complex narrative of suffering that had characterized Ukraine during those dark years. The stories of Babyn Yar would continue to be told, The memories of those who fell into the trap of hatred and violence remained alive in the minds of their loved ones. Kyiv, despite its heartbreaking past, stood firm, once again seeking its place under the rule of Joseph Stalin, who led the Soviet Union to which they now belonged once more. And although their return to the communist superpower was not welcomed by many, they were no longer under German control, and certainly not under the Führer.